All right, so as I mentioned, we're going to Sub-Saharan Africa now. Defining that region, it's obviously below the Saharan Desert. It can go from Sudan, Chad, Niger, Mali, all the way down. And there's actually 46 different countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, so it's very diverse, and we can't cover everything, but we will do our best to do a general outline of Sub-Saharan Africa. So as an introduction, this is a very diverse region, as I just mentioned, with 46 different countries, many different ethnicities, religions, languages, foods, livelihoods, etc. It's the world's fastest growing region. It has 1.2 billion people and has a natural increase rate of 2.5%. It's also the world's poorest region, with the majority of its population living in poverty on less than $2 a day. That being said, it is also resource rich, as we'll discuss moving along. And it's often associated with economic poverty and social problems, including disease, conflict, and corruption. So going to the physical geography of this is an ancient continent, all right? It's very far from any major tectonic boundaries, although we'll talk about the Rift Valley soon. And they consider it the plateau continent. So there's a great escarpment in the south, and you can see ringing all along the coastline. There's the coastline, and you see these mountainous chains. And in the middle, we have all these inland basins and plateaus. Some of the interior basins include the Congo, which is right in the middle basin, the Chad one, which is in the country of Chad, Niger, as well as the Kalahari, which is down in the south in Botswana. Now, the major mountains, there are some in the central and western part, but the major mountains are in the eastern highlands. And we're going to talk about that Rift Valley coming up. But large mountains, volcanoes, lakes, etc. Now, typically speaking, across the continent, since it is so old, it has rather poor soils. Since they're old, they've been weathered away and eroded away quite a bit. There are exceptions in the river floodplains, like the Niger Delta, and also in the volcanic areas of the highlands of East Africa. But even though it's poor, the soils are relatively poor, it does have a lot of mineral wealth because it's an ancient shield. So as everything has been weathered away, those veins of minerals are closer to the surface and are able to be exploited. So looking at plate tectonics, you can see that it's in the middle of the African plate. The one exception that we can see, though, is that Rift Valley. And we're going to talk about that. It's a divergent plate boundary that runs down the East Africa highlands. So a Rift Valley is where the plate is actually breaking up and it's separating out. And so they call this the Great East African Rift Valley. And it's in between these red areas. And here you can see where you have a weak spot in the crust and magma can come up. It then creates grabens where the pulls apart and the middle drops down. And then you can have volcanic activity that comes up along the edges of these. And on the map on the left, you can see all those Mount Elgin, Mount Kenya, Kilimanjaro, Mount Meru, all those volcanoes. There's a couple others along those rift valleys. Another thing is you have a lot of lakes and rivers that form and run down the middle of those rift valleys. Here's just an image of this with some volcanoes in the background. But that means it does have high population densities because with adequate moisture from the uplifting and the highlands, more temperate climate, as well as the fertile soils from the volcanic activity, meaning it's a lot of small farmers, a lot of agriculture, and the high population densities there. Here's just a picture of Kilimanjaro with the giraffe in the middle, of course. Now, the major rivers, the Congo is the largest. And it has the second largest watershed in the world behind the Amazon. And you can see it takes up the entire Congo basin and then comes out in the Congo. The Niger River starts up here in West Africa, makes its way up through the desert near Timbuktu, and then comes on down and comes out the Nigerian Delta in Nigeria. So that's like a water lifeline in that region as well for irrigation and transport. The Nile starts in the highlands and makes its way, of course, to the Mediterranean. And that's the longest river in the world. And then in the southern part, we have the Zambezi River. So it drains the southern part. I did little circles for each of those. Now, an interesting thing on the Zambezi River is Victoria Falls. It's like the Niagara Falls of southern Africa. Here's another view of it. And one thing that with some of these rivers, especially with the Zambezi, is they've been able to produce hydroelectric electricity out of them by building dams. Now for climate, this is the one that really follows the model very nicely. So along the equator, we have our tropical wet, and that's that AF climate that you see. And that's along the intertropical convergence zone. And so the equator is running right through the middle. North or south of the equator, you get tropical savannas. So you know they'll have a distinct dry season. The wet season would be on the northern side, would be in the North American summertime. And then the North American winter time, or the Northern Hemisphere winter time, that would then be the dry season. And that's reverse south of the equator. Then as you get just a little bit further out, you start drying out. So around the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn, you see these dry steppes as well as deserts, such as the Sahara. Down here in the south, the Namib Desert, the Kalahari Desert, and those steppe climates. And then in South Africa, we have Mediterranean climates for growing things like grapes, so very much like California. And then we have a mild mid-latitude climate, kind of like the southeast of the United States. And then the Eastern Highlands, we have more temperate climates because of the elevation. We do see a slight monsoon over here in West Africa. And then looking at Madagascar, if we were actually talking together in class, I'd ask you to try to describe what's happening there. And think of it just the same as the Caribbean. You have trade winds coming in on this direction from the southwest. They're hitting the mountainous chain, causing a tropical wet climate on that windward side. And then you have a tropical savanna on the leeward rain shadow side, as well as some steppe climates in the southern one. So this is very similar to what we saw in the Caribbean. Vegetation goes right along with this. We have rainforest, the Ituri rainforest. There's some rainforest in Madagascar. Much of it's been cleared though, and much of this coastal rainforest has been cleared, but the Ituri is still there. Then as you move further away, we get savannas. So it'll be kind of trees and grasses, and then as you keep going further away and it gets drier and drier, you start getting into grasslands, steppe, and then eventually deserts. And then a bit of Mediterranean in South Africa. But again, just note that transition as you're moving from the equator, either north or south, as it gets drier and drier. And then the highland is mixed with a lot of forests. So here's just some pictures of tropical rainforest along the Congo River. Then here's tropical savanna. You see it's more woodland. As you get further and further away, it gets drier and drier. And eventually you get into desert, like the Sahara. To the north. And to the south, we have places like the Kalahari Desert with the Kalahari Bushmen shown here. And this is the Namib Desert. It's along the coastline, on that western coastline of southern Africa. And then the Mediterranean vineyards in South Africa. Now, for environmental issues, we have quite a few of them to talk about. There's a region called the Sahel, and this is that transition between the savannas and the Sahara, that kind of steppe climates. And you can see it here on this map going straight across that middle part of the African continent. And desertification is a big concern, and that's what those colors are showing, as areas that are susceptible to desertification, which is the increasing of desert-like conditions. So what might used to be savanna or grassland or steppe is becoming more like deserts. There's natural contributions in terms of cycles of rainfall. It goes in about a 20-year period of extra rain to 20 years of drought. But there's human contributions as well, as people have settled there and they settle down and they start growing their crops or raising their cattle or clearing trees for fuel wood. That contributes to desertification too. So it's a combination. This is an area where you see a lot of famines that occur during those bad parts of drought, and the crops don't make it in. Now, another problem, of course, is deforestation. So on here, we can see some of the tropical rainforest, and the Ituri rainforest is right here in the Congo Basin. It's called the Ituri, and it's being encroached upon on the edges. The coastal rainforest has mostly been destroyed for settlement and agriculture, and Madagascar has done the same thing. Much of their forests have disappeared. The savanna forests suffer from problems like fuel wood and making charcoal. And in the highland forest, they're also suffering from, agriculture, especially for growing crops in these highlands. Here's an example in West Africa and the Ivory Coast. And there's a national park on both sides. And in the middle is farmland. So small farm fragments in 1988. And here it is in 2002. And you can see it's been clear cut all the way up to the edge of those parks. So just going back, there's still small forests in the middle. And now it's been completely cleared for intensive cultivation, deforestation, and also things like cocoa plantations and palm plantations. This is a picture of people creating charcoal. So cutting down the forest and converting it into charcoal. And this is in Madagascar, where they've cleared much of the forest, and hence you end up seeing this type of erosion that results. Other concerns include wildlife conservation. Obviously, much of Sub-Saharan Africa has many, many species, from gorillas, elephants, rhinos, tigers, you name it. There's giraffes. There's quite a bit of those. And so in East Africa and South Africa, there's a lot of wildlife reserves to try to protect them, as well as the tourist destinations for people going on safari. Another key thing is to try to protect elephants is the ban on the ivory trade. There's a lot of poaching of elephants, and they're endangered because people want their ivory. But some of these reserves and the ban on ivory have had impacts on people. Many of them lose access to their resources, loss of traditional hunting grounds, and loss of income from the ivory trade. So there's a much larger debate to have about this. I'll give you one of them. There's a couple concepts. One is called fortress conservation. That means that they should have armed guards, fences, and just keep people out with armed, by force. The other one is to actually have communities manage these wildlife reserves. Allow them to maybe cull a few elephants or a few things from time to time. And then that way they will actually protect it from poachers because it's one of their own resources. So there's debates about how to go about protecting nature in Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, we'll move on to population geography. So Sub-Saharan Africa has 1.2 billion people, about 37% urban, but their cities are exploding in size. The densities are rather low, especially in the deserts and rainforests. But physiological densities are high. Remember, that's the amount of people per arable unit of arable land that you can farm on. Because again, much of the soils are relatively poor. And the agricultural densities are high as well. That's the number of farmers per unit of arable land. So that means there's a lot of subsistence farmers. Some big clusters, though, are like in Nigeria, has 183 million. The Eastern Highlands, you can see some clusters there, and Eastern South Africa as well. Here's just a picture of a family. Overall, in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's on average of at least 4 kids per family as an average for the entire continent. And here's just a rural community where people are living out in the countryside, surrounded by their fields and farms. And here's settlements along some of the rivers in the rainforest. That's where most people will live, is actually close to the rivers for transportation, etc. But like I said, the cities are starting to explode. This is Lagos, Nigeria. It has one of the highest growth rates in the world, and you can see the congestion and how many people are there. This is another picture of Lagos at a market, and you can see the markets there and not a proper way of disposing of waste. So it's all just piled up right next to the road. So looking at the crude birth rate, you can see that it's the highest. They have the highest crude birth rates in the world. That's in the dark purples. The total fertility rate also is amongst the highest in the world. You can see it's a little lower in the really far south of Sub-Saharan Africa. And then the crude death rates are also much higher, and this is mostly due to disease, sanitation, lack of access to medical care. And putting that all together, we have a very large percent of their population that's under the age of 15. So in those green areas, that's 40% or more of their population are under the age of 15. So they're about to come into their reproducing years. So the populations will still continue to grow for a while. But you also have a high infant mortality rate. Those red ones, if it's 60 and above, that means over 6 kids will not make it to their first birthday. And some are higher than that. And then that leads to the highest natural increase rates. So overall, for population demographics, the natural increase rate is about on total 2.5% per year. That means it would be a doubling time of 28 years. The fertility rate is 5.1, so on average, a woman will have 5 children. We'd already talked about the percent under the age of 15, and then life expectancies are very low as well. So Niger is one of the fastest growing countries in the world. We've talked about them before in your population exercise, I believe. 24.5 million people, but a 3.7% growth rate. And the fertility rate is 6.8, almost 7, and a life expectancy of 60. So this is one of the fastest growing countries in the world. South Africa is on the other side of the spectrum, 59 million people. Its growth rate is much lower at 1.1%, and their fertility rate is still above replacement level at 2.34, but that's coming down. And life expectancy is much higher as it is a wealthier country. You can see it was growing as a pyramid, and they made a change, it looks like around 30 years ago, and they're transitioning into lower growth. And part of that is lack of family planning and access to family planning. So most of those countries that are in the lightest shade on this one is below 25% of women use family planning. And that leads us into health geography, as sometimes this is related. So Sub-Saharan Africa has kind of the climates that are conducive to a lot of these diseases. They also have several types of mosquitoes that can carry things like malaria. and many other things. And lack of sanitation and ways to get rid of mosquitoes creates a lot of problems. So on the left-hand side, the whole area in green has malaria. In the shaded areas, yellow fever. And E is the Ebola disease. Ebola is one of the worst diseases in the world. It usually kills its victims very quickly. Historically, as when these places were isolated from each other and they didn't have really good infrastructure or transport, it would run its course in one village without leaving to go to another one. But today we've had some recent outbreaks of Ebola and people are moving now more. And so it can transfer from one place to another. And we had a big one a few years ago. In the middle one, we have things like river blindness and schistosomiasis, which is a worm disease. So is river blindness. We'll talk about that coming up. And on the right side, things like sleeping sickness, etc. So malaria comes from the bites of mosquitoes. They carry a virus in them that attacks red blood cells. And it's very endemic and very much in places like Sub-Saharan Africa. And there are medicines for it, but it's become resistant to a lot of those in the last 50 years. The best way to avoid it is to use bed nets, for example. So they tend to bite at night. River blindness comes from the black fly. It's actually a worm, a parasite that gets into the black fly from the river. Then the black fly bites a person, and then those worms go into the person's body and bloodstream where it multiplies. And over the course of up to 30 years, it'll multiply in the body, causing lots of itching and weaknesses. And then it'll collect in your eye and cause scarring in the eye and cause people to go blind when they're about 30 years old. As a side note, I used to show a video on this. And in the 1980s, we had some breaks. Something in the United States happened where we got made dewormers for our pets, for our dogs. If you guys had a dog, right, they have to get a deworming. But they were able to then make it work for humans. But the people were too poor in places like Togo to afford the drugs. So the company, the pharmaceutical company, decided to give it out free of charge for how long it took to combat it. And people have to take it once a year, or else the worms can come back. And so in places like Togo, they've reached some success in handling river blindness based on what we do for our pets, which is kind of a sad commentary. Another big problem is just safe drinking water. And this is a major problem, especially for children who can get diarrhea from this and can become dehydrated and die. So they have a thing called oral rehydration therapy, which is just 8 teaspoons of sugar, 1 teaspoon of salt, and 1 quart of water. And that can allow you to rehydrate. And then, of course, there's HIV/AIDS. Now, while I say it here, it's the world's #1 infectious disease killer of adults. That's not quite true. It just compromises your immune system so that you'll die from a common cold or something else. Now, it began in Africa, and they believe it came over from monkeys into humans. In the countryside, in the jungle, oftentimes when they don't have enough food, they'll eat what they call bushmeat, where they'll go out and they'll hunt down things like chimpanzees. And they believe that one of them, either through the blood, through the butchering of it, or being bitten, transferred it into humans, and then it started to spread. 2 million people per year die, but 2.7 million get infected every year. So it's still growing. And 40.4 million have died overall. And here's some of the numbers. In 1980, there was estimated to have 200,000 cases. By 1990, it was 8 million cases around the world. By 2000, it was 29 million. And just this past year, it got up to 39 million. So you can see that it is still growing and spreading. This shows the share of your population of people 15 to 49 that are infected with HIV. And you can see in the southern part of Africa is kind of ground zero for this. Most of those are above 10% and can go all the way up to 25% of their population, adults. And here's prevalence rate by country. Like I said, almost 25% in places like Swaziland, Botswana, Lesotho, etc. So very high rates in Southern Africa. Okay, we're going to stop sharing right now and take a break before we start moving into ethnicities and cultural aspects for Sub-Saharan Africa. If we were in class, it'd be a lot nicer to have some discussions about HIV/AIDS and some of the things that are being done in Sub-Saharan Africa to combat that. For example, Botswana, which has relatively more wealth than some of the other countries, they decided that they would they would give out free testing and free medicine, but nobody wanted to get tested because they'd have to be asked, by their loved ones or their community, and there's a stigma attached to it. Why are you getting tested for HIV/AIDS? Are you sleeping around or whatever's going on? So what they decided to do, because no one was going to get tested and not using the medicine, they then said they made a proclamation that anybody that went to the hospital for any reason, for a cold, a broken toe, whatever it is, you had to be tested. And that meant that they didn't have to explain why they were being tested. Everyone gets tested. And so they've had a really good job of finding out who actually has HIV/AIDS and getting them the drugs and the treatment that they deserve. So again, it's a long conversation, but we're going to end it here right now.